They called Kaya Thorne Backup, a name that meant expendable. Frank Dalton laughed, said she was only there to fill a seat. But when the mission fell apart and the ridge went silent, it was Kaya's voice that came through calm, commanding codename Iron Widow. They thought she was just a footnote. What they didn't know, she was the fail-safe. Stick around because the soldier they sidelined just rewrote the outcome of the entire war. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from and what time it is there. Comment below and subscribe to stay updated. In the dimly lit command center, Major Frank Dalton's fingers drummed against the polished surface of his service pistol, a habit born from 2 decades of asserting dominance. The morning briefing was his stage, and he intended to remind everyone, especially that upstart intelligence analyst Sergeant Kaya Thorne, of the natural order of things. Combat roles require more than just reading reports. Major Frank Dalton announced, his voice carrying the weight of 20 years of combat experience. He fixed his gaze on Sergeant Thorne, watching her maintain that irritatingly composed posture. Some of us earned our positions the traditional way. The command center's usual hum of activity fell silent. Major Frank Dalton savored the moment, adjusting his perfectly pressed uniform. His hand instinctively moved to his service pistol thumb, tracing the unit insignia, a gesture that usually reminded others of his authority. But something felt different today. Sergeant Thorne's eyes held an unsettling glint of defiance. Major Frank Dalton's grip tightened on his pistol as he stepped closer to her station. Perhaps, Sergeant, you'd like to demonstrate your combat readiness. His words dripped with sarcasm, drawing a few nervous chuckles from the junior officers. Actually, sir, I would. Her response caught him off guard. Before he could respond, the base alarm blared. Multiple breach points, 50 hostiles. And somehow Sergeant Thorne was already moving. Major Frank Dalton watched the security feeds, his world unraveling in precisely 9 minutes and 37 seconds. Each target Thorne eliminated was a bullet through his prejudices. Her movements were poetry, her strategy flawless. The pistol at his hip felt heavier with each passing second. Sir! His aide interrupted, tablet in hand. Thorne effect is trending. CNN's picking up the story. The screen showed the footage, his morning confrontation with Thorne, followed by her extraordinary combat performance. His words about traditional ways played on repeat, a damning contrast to her excellence. The Joint Chiefs want your full assessment of Sergeant Thorne's performance, sir. Another aide announced. They're calling it the Thorne Protocol now. Standing alone in his office, Major Frank Dalton unholstered his service pistol, placing it on his desk. Its gleam seemed diminished somehow, like his certainty. The distant sounds of combat training echoed through the walls, and for the first time in his career, he questioned everything he thought he knew about warfare. Drop one in the comments if you've ever had your deepest beliefs challenged, like Major Frank Dalton. What happens next? His world is crumbling, and this is just the beginning. Major Frank Dalton's fingers traced the edge of his pristine command insignia as he watched Sergeant Kaya Thorne through the command post window. The morning light caught the stack of commendation files he'd deliberately buried under routine paperwork, each one documenting her exceptional marksmanship. His chest tightened as he remembered dismissing those same records during her transfer review. Analytics suits your temperament, he'd told her 3 hours ago, the words now tasting like ash in his mouth. The gentle click of her keyboard through the glass seemed to mock him, each keystroke a reminder of the cage he'd built. Major Frank Dalton pulled her personnel file from his drawer, the classified stamp stark against the manila folder. The evidence of his willful blindness spread across his desk like an indictment. Sniper school ranked first in a class of 50. Advanced tactical operations, perfect scores across the board. Combat simulations that broke previous records. Major Frank Dalton's hand trembled as he reached for his coffee-spilling drops onto the evaluation forms, where he'd consistently steered her toward support roles. Sir, his aide's voice startled him. The quarterly diversity report is due. Leave it. Major Frank Dalton snapped his eyes fixed on a photograph of Thorne's graduating class. She stood at the edge despite having the highest scores. He'd done that, pushed her to the periphery, made her smaller. The command insignia caught the light again, and he found himself unable to meet its reflection. A message notification pinged on his computer. Another combat deployment request for Thorne, another opportunity to keep her confined to the analytics desk. Major Frank Dalton's finger hovered over the denial button, muscle memory from 100 similar moments. The weight of tradition of "that's how it's always been" pressed down on him like a physical force. He opened his browser, typing with sharp, angry strokes, "Military Gender Integration Studies." The research filled his screen. Data proving enhanced unit effectiveness, improved problem-solving, decreased toxic leadership incidents. Major Frank Dalton's jaw clenched as he recognized his own behavior in the case studies of institutional resistance. "Have you reviewed Sergeant Thorne's latest tactical assessment?" Colonel Rivera's voice came from the doorway, making him start. The colonel's eyes held a knowing look that made Major Frank Dalton's neck burn. Just now, he managed, gesturing to the spread of papers. "Interesting timing," Rivera noted, leaving the implication hanging in the air. Type "truth hurts" if you've ever faced your own biases. Major Frank Dalton's hand went to his command insignia again, but this time its polished surface felt like it was burning his fingers. In his reflection, he saw every dismissive gesture, every interrupted presentation, every denied field operation. The system hadn't created these barriers. He had maintained them, reinforced them, hidden behind them. The sound of Thorne's typing continued steady and professional, despite everything. Major Frank Dalton stood walking to the window, separating his office from the operations room. How many others had he pushed aside, tucked away into corners because their excellence made him uncomfortable? The question sat like lead in his stomach. His phone buzzed. A message from command requesting updated personnel deployments. Major Frank Dalton looked at his insignia one last time, seeing not authority, now, but responsibility. The weight of years of wrongful decisions pressed down on him, threatening to crack his carefully maintained facade. The typing stopped. Through the glass, he watched Sergeant Thorne stand gathering her files with the same precision she'd shown on the shooting range. Major Frank Dalton's throat tightened as he realized every keystroke, every analysis, every perfectly formatted report had been a bullet in its own right. Evidence of excellence confined, waiting to break free. The morning sun caught his command insignia again, but now its gleam seemed less like authority and more like a spotlight illuminating truths he could no longer ignore. Major Frank Dalton sat heavily in his chair, the sound of his own prejudices typing away in the next room, each keystroke, a reminder of talent caged by his own hands. Major Frank Dalton's hands trembled as he watched the surveillance feeds, each screen revealing the devastating efficiency of Sergeant Kaya Thorne's precision strikes. His command center, usually a fortress of his authority, now felt like a cage documenting his colossal misjudgment. The metallic weight of his command insignia pressed against his chest like an accusation. Through the monitors, the evidence of his prejudice played out in high definition. 50 confirmed eliminations in 10 minutes, each shot precise, each decision tactical. The very skills he dismissed as impossible for an analyst now saved the lives he'd endangered with his bias. His throat constricted as the kill counter kept rising. "Sir, CNN is already running the story." Lieutenant Hayes reported, his voice carrying an edge of barely concealed judgment. "The footage from Alpha Company's helmet cams. It's trending. So, Dalton's fail." Frank Dalton's fingers instinctively reached for his command insignia, the cold metal no longer a symbol of earned authority, but a reminder of his catastrophic arrogance. The social media notifications flooded his phone. Military forums, veteran groups, even his own subordinates sharing the footage of how his prejudice had nearly cost American lives. "Major Dalton," the base commander's voice crackled through his private line. "My office, now." The words landed like artillery shells. In the corridor, screens mounted on the walls displayed the ongoing news coverage. His own words from this morning's briefing played back in devastating clarity. "Analytics is where you belong, Sergeant. Leave the combat operations to those trained for it." The irony twisted in his gut like a knife, walking past the tactical operations room. Frank Dalton caught his reflection in the darkened windows. The man who had prided himself on tactical excellence now saw only a commander whose prejudices had nearly sacrificed his own people. The mission success rate statistics on the wall behind him seemed to mock his previous certainty about proper military roles. His phone buzzed again. Another news alert. Military intelligence analyst proves combat excellence. Questions raised about leadership bias. The words blurred as cold sweat trickled down his spine. Each step toward the commander's office felt heavier than the last. "Have you seen what they're saying about your judgment call, sir?" The question came from Captain Rivera, once his most steadfast supporter. The subtle emphasis on judgment cut deep. Frank Dalton watched his carefully constructed world of military hierarchy and rigid beliefs crumble with each passing hour. Type prejudice kills if you've ever seen bias endanger lives. In his 20 years of service, Major Frank Dalton had never felt more alone. The command center, usually his domain of absolute control, now hummed with whispers and sidelong glances. His command insignia, which had once filled him with pride, now felt like a brand of shame against his chest. The security footage played on loop in his mind. Sergeant Thorne's flawless execution, her tactical brilliance saving the very lives his prejudice had endangered. Each shot she took dismantled not just the enemy, but the entire framework of his beliefs about military capability and gender roles. "Sir." His aide appeared at the door. "The Joint Chiefs want a full report on today's operation. They're particularly interested in your initial deployment decisions regarding Sergeant Thorne." Frank Dalton's empire of certainty was collapsing, and he had no one to blame but himself. The worst part wasn't the viral headlines or the pending investigation. It was the realization that his own biases had nearly cost American lives. His hands shook as he reached again for his command insignia, wondering how much longer he would have the right to wear it. Major Frank Dalton grips the binoculars tighter, his weathered command insignia heavy against his chest, as he watches Sergeant Thorne move through the combat zone with lethal grace. Each precise shot echoes across the valley, mocking his earlier dismissal of her capabilities. "Target eliminated!" crackles through his radio for what feels like the 100th time, each confirmation a hammer blow to his pride. His knuckles whiten around the binoculars as another enemy combatant falls to Thorne's expertise. "That's 47. His aide whispers the awe in his voice, making Frank's jaw clench. The timing display on his tactical watch shows just over 9 minutes since the operation began. His earlier words to the command staff ring hollow now. Intelligence analysts belong behind desks, not in combat zones. The brass casings hitting the ground below sound like tiny bells tolling the death of his prejudices. Frank absently touches his command insignia, remembering how proudly he'd polished it this morning, certain of his authority, his judgment. Now each ping of metal on Earth marks another crack in his carefully constructed worldview. 48, 49. The count continues, and Frank feels sweat trickle down his neck, despite the cool mountain air. He'd built his career on traditional military doctrine on clear divisions between roles. Yet here was Thorne, demolishing not just the enemy, but every preconception he'd held sacred. Base. The final shot rings out at 9 minutes and 37 seconds. 50 confirmed eliminations, comes the official count. Frank lowers his binoculars slowly, his hands trembling slightly. The silence that follows feels deafening, broken only by the gentle wind carrying the acrid scent of gunpowder up the hillside. His radio crackles. "Permission to return to base, sir." Thorne's voice is professional controlled, not a hint of triumph or reproach. It makes Frank's shame burn hotter. Permission granted, Sergeant. He manages his voice rough. And exceptional work out there. The words taste like ashes in his mouth, but they need to be said. His command insignia catches the sun again, the light reflecting differently now. Less like authority, more like a spotlight exposing his failures. Type prejudice falls, if you've ever seen someone shatter your preconceptions. Gathering his composure, Frank turns to his aide. Prepare a formal commendation for Sergeant Thorne, and schedule a review of our combat role assignments, all of them. The words cost him, but the price of maintaining his prejudices has become too high. The walk back to base feels longer than usual, each step weighted with realization. How many other talented soldiers had he miscast? How many careers had his biases stunted? His command insignia grows heavier with each thought. Within hours, the video from the operation's drone footage goes viral within military channels. Dalton learns trends briefly among service members, a digital monument to his humbling. Frank watches the footage once alone in his office, counting each elimination again. 50 targets, 9 minutes, 37 seconds, and one major's worldview completely transformed. The greatest enemy wasn't in that valley, he dictates into his official report later. It was in my own mind, and Sergeant Thorne eliminated it with the same precision she showed in combat. Share this story to challenge someone's prejudices about military roles. Drop 2 if you believe in breaking barriers. Major Frank Dalton's hands trembled as he stood before the gilded mirror in his office, meticulously removing the command insignia that had defined him for 2 decades. Each pin felt heavier than the last, weighted with the gravity of his transformed understanding. The morning sun caught the polished metal one final time, a reminder of the power he'd wielded so carelessly. I remember dismissing her without a second thought. He whispered to his reflection, the words tasting bitter. How many others did I silence with my arrogance? The evidence lay scattered across his desk. Performance reviews he'd written, recommendations he'd blocked, careers he'd stunted. All because they didn't fit his narrow vision of a warrior. The security footage from that decisive day played on loop in his mind. Sergeant Kaya Thorne moving with lethal precision through the combat zone, her intelligence analysis background informing every perfect shot, every strategic movement. 50 targets neutralized in 10 minutes. The impossible made possible by someone he'd deemed incapable. Major Frank Dalton's fingers brushed against the formal resignation letter on his desk, his signature still fresh. The words blurred as he read them again. My prejudices endangered not just careers, but lives. The system I defended was built on false assumptions about capability and worth. I cannot in good conscience continue to uphold these barriers. The ceremony hall buzzed with anticipation. Major Frank Dalton stood at attention, his chest conspicuously bare of the command insignia, as Sergeant Thorne approached the podium. The overhead lights caught the newest medal on her uniform, the one he'd fought so hard to deny her. The irony wasn't lost on him. Leadership isn't about maintaining the system. He addressed the assembled troops, his voice carrying to every corner. It's about recognizing excellence wherever it hides. I stand before you today not as your commander, but as living proof that the strongest walls are the ones we build in our minds. Social media exploded with Fadrichan Dalton learns trending worldwide. The video of his speech, intercut with the security footage of Thorne's combat excellence, had gone viral. The comment section filled with similar stories of prejudice overcome, of minds changed, of barriers broken. His final act as Major Frank Dalton was signing the comprehensive review that would reshape combat role assignments throughout the military. Capability knows no gender, no background, no predetermined path, he wrote in the conclusion. Our strength lies in recognizing talent in all its forms. Drop 3 if this story changed your perspective on leadership. The command insignia now sat in a display case at the Military Leadership Museum, accompanied by a simple plaque, donated by Frank Dalton, a reminder that true strength lies in admitting our mistakes and growing from them, standing in the museum. Weeks later, Frank Dalton watched as young officers paused before the display. Your resignation inspired my transition from intelligence to combat roles, a young analyst told him, eyes bright with possibility. Thank you for showing us that change starts from the top. He touched the glass gently, feeling the weight of his journey in that simple gesture. The hardest battle, he reflected, isn't fought with weapons but with our own preconceptions. And sometimes victory means surrendering what we thought we knew. Share this story with Multiphonic, Breaking Barriers, if you believe in the power of change. The setting sun painted the museum walls in shades of gold, a fitting backdrop for this final scene of transformation. Frank Dalton's reflection in the display case showed a different man than the one who had once dismissed Sergeant Thorne. Humbler, wiser, and ultimately stronger for having fallen.